works usually means 2, 3, sometimes more implementations of the spec. So when HTML4 was developed 10 years ago, there was no such thing as a candidate recommendation. W3C moved much faster and people just said, yeah, we'll do all this stuff. So they put things in the spec, they all agreed, and they published it. And then no one actually implemented it. Same thing happened to XHTML. Microsoft said, XHTML is a great idea, we think it'll be brilliant, go right ahead, and then they didn't implement it. And they still haven't. It's only been 10 years. But every other browser does, so it clearly works. Candidate recommendation is to show that when people implement the specification, when they put it in their browser or in their authoring tool, it really, really works. So you demonstrate that it all works. You have endless tests to pass. When you've got proof that it works, you go and say, we want to make this a proposed recommendation. So you go back to Tim Berners-Lee and you say, all right, everyone agrees this is good, we can prove that it really works, we want it to be a recommendation. And then W3C actually asks the members what they think. So every member then gets a chance to, members think that what they're doing is voting. Actually, they're advising. They're saying, we think this is good, we plan to use this, whatever. And not all members answer, but when something comes up, I'm the Opera representative as a member, so I get every spec that W3C does. At some point comes to me and they say, does Opera approve this spec? And sometimes I say nothing because it's not relevant to us. We don't have a SOAP implementation that we use or care about, so we don't say much about SOAP usually. We do care about HTML and SVG, so we obviously say things about that. We can say no. Remember that at this stage, the whole working group has agreed this is correct. They've convinced the rest of the world that this is correct. Or, if someone objected, the director and W3C have looked at that objection and either said to the working group, no, this person is right, you have to go back to working draft and fix it so that you do what they suggest, or something that makes them happy. Or they say, no, this person is crazy, this suggestion is stupid, don't worry about it. And it's been implemented. So voting against something at that stage happens, but it's rare. And mostly, in my experience, it happens for political reasons. And when organizations do it, W3C looks, because it's rare, they look very carefully. They discuss with whoever voted against it why, and they make a decision. It has happened a couple of times that some organisation says, no, this is wrong. This really, really doesn't work despite everything you've done. And they say, actually that's true, and send it back to working draft. Most of the time, it turns out that an organisation, usually a company, says, no, this is not appropriate because there's better technology, blah, blah, blah. You should be using Silverlight if they're Microsoft, something we developed if we're Opera, or whatever. If it's some political reason, nearly always they throw out the objection and they make it a recommendation. And they have overridden very strong complaints from very large companies. They're not pushed around by a big company. But they do go and talk to people and say, well, is this going to kill this thing? Or is it just that one company doesn't like it, or two companies don't like it? So eventually you get a recommendation, the standard that modern recommendations from W3C are implemented, tested, they're pretty good quality. Stuff from 10 years ago didn't have nearly as much of this quality, so it wasn't tested, you didn't have to implement it, you could put any old thing in a spec, and if everybody agreed, that was okay. So that's the main product of W3C, is these recommendations that have been through this very exhaustive and very public process. There are other activities, the interest groups. You have a semantic web interest group, an SVG interest group, an accessibility interest group, various others. These are groups, they're really mostly mailing lists. They're open to anybody, so anyone can join. The people discuss technology. Sometimes interest groups will try and make tutorials or make explanations or look at stuff. They will describe use cases. People who don't want to be involved in the working group will say, I'm trying to do this, here's what I'm trying to do in the interest group, and the working group will look at what the interest group says they need to look at. And tests. The working group needs thousands of tests for most specifications, and people in a working group usually have a full-time job and spend half a day or a day a week, at most, on the working group. If you have 15 people with a full-time job plus this extra work, and you say, by the way, would you write 1,000 tests next week? The answers are often very predictable. So interest groups are used as a place where people give tests. There are some other documents, as well as recommendations. There are notes and submissions. These things are not approved by W3C in any way. W3C doesn't necessarily agree with the content. All they do is say, if you're any member, and say, we have this idea for technology. You send it there, W3C publishes it, and guarantees that it will stay with that web address and stay stable and be the same document forever. So it's just a way to make stuff stable. It's used for ideas. Sometimes working groups write down history or things that they thought of along the way that they think will be useful to people who are trying to understand their work in 10 years' time. The team sometimes writes ideas or writes about stuff that they've been doing in their own time that they think will be valuable. These things are not standards. Nobody has agreed with it, nobody has approved it. There is one that is actually used as a standard. It's a date-time format. It's pretty simple. It says you can describe a date and time as year dash month dash day, and then you can add hours, minutes, seconds in some particular format. This is extremely widely used. It is part of other standards from other organizations, and it's really basic, and it more or less works for a bunch of things. But it was just the idea of a couple of guys about how you should write down dates on the web. Nobody's ever thought it needs to be more standard than that on the web, so there's never been a push to do anything else with it. It's fine, it works.